Thank you. Let's see, I'm going to share my screen. Thank you, everyone. And there we go. All right, you should be seeing my screen now. And let's see, if the audio is working okay, can you give me a heart emoji? And if it's still problematic, throw something in the chat for us so we can make sure the audio is okay. Okay, good, this is good. Oh, still bad, okay. Here, quick. Let's see, it sounds underwater. Give me 30 seconds. Let's see if this works better. Let's see, hold tight. Magic of technology. Here, hold on 1 second. We'll see if this works better. Let's see if this is better.
I'm jumping back on while we get this because I have to call out some of the amazing comments from people. It sounds bathtubby. I like that. I think that's a new word we can start using. Bathtubby. And we'll see if we completely blurbling in the bubbles. That takes a second. I don't know, Robin. That one's pretty good too. Bathtubby, blurbing in the bubbles. You are, just so you know, Carla, we can hear you. It's not that we can't hear you. Okay. You just sound like perhaps you're in an engine room or something like that, which, you know, isn't the worst thing. There are worse things that you could sound like me. That could be much worse. You could sound like me.
All right. Well, I think
let's just go with it. Let's go with it. Just roll with it.
We'll just go with what we've got. And apologies to those who are not hearing this super well. Let's see. Okay, so today talking about evaluation, which lots of people want to talk about, especially in terms of microlearning. I think there's lots of opportunities as well. So let's see. This is me. Christopher already asked me to introduce myself a little bit. So again, my contact information is here. If anybody has questions now or later, you can connect on LinkedIn. I'll throw my stuff in the chat later too. And if you don't know my work, I've written a couple of books on the topic of microlearning. I have a chapter in these books as well. But I want to know you guys. Enough about me. My first question is, type in the chat, what's your role? Learning technologist, instructional designer, learning leader, maybe something else. So go ahead. In the chat, who do we have today? And I'm going to try to keep up as this scrolls. Learning designer, lots of learning designers. Yep. E-learning folks, training development specialists. Yep. Corporate trainer. Oh, excellent. A bit of everything. Yep. ID consultant. Meta universe designer. I love it. Professor and instructional designer. Corporate trainer. Awesome. Director of instructional design. Yep. Program leaders. E-learning, LMS. Yep. Awesome. Yep. Learning solutions consultant. Excellent. Okay. Excellent. Thank you. So good to know just a little bit about all the folks we've got in our room with us today. So I've got 2 more questions for you. I'm going to keep this quick to keep it peppy. But what is your experience with microlearning? Go ahead and use your voting tools. You see my scale there from none to a lot. I'm just kind of looking through here. We've got a lot of the middle 2. We've got some the sunglasses a little bit and quite a bit, and a few on the edges as well. Okay, great. So we've got some folks with experience doing microlearning, and I am going to ask that again, as we saw in Carl and Robin's session. If you've got suggestions, thoughts, comments, ideas, oh, I'm sipping ahead here. Please do throw those in the chat. And my next question is the same scale, but what is your experience with assessing microlearning? Let's see. What are the votes like there? Yep. I was expecting this. We're all sliding a little bit down on that scale. I will admit, I am too, right? I've got more experience designing and developing e-learning or microlearning than assessing, right? It's a new-ish idea, right? And we're all kind of putting our arms around it. So, and I think as a general thing, us learning and development folks have more experience with designing, implementing than we do with the evaluation. But yes, so we're all friends here. No questions too small, no questions too big. Let's get them out on the table. I'm going to share with you a few things that I've been working on, some things that I've been thinking about, and ask you guys to share your thoughts in the chat as we go as well. So let's see, just switching screens there. There we go. So first off, I know Carl and Robin, I was in their session earlier. They gave some ideas for what microlearning is. My definition is actually very, very similar to theirs. And it is this, that microlearning is content that's purposely shortened to enable the learner to fit learning within their personal and work lives. And to me, I think it's really important that we're remembering, like, we're juggling a lot of things, right? And so learning is always taking a backseat to work priorities, potentially home priorities, all of that. And so microlearning is that stuff we've shortened up so people can learn within all those other things they're doing. So if you've seen me present before, I like to think of microlearning in 4 different use cases. And I know Robin and Carl, they talked about a few different uses of microlearning as well. I'm going to share this only because it's going to come back when we talk about assessment. So the first, I'll give these 4 use cases plus 4 common names you hear being used as well. So microlearning is often used in preparation for long form instruction. Again, I don't want to get rid of long form instruction, so we do see microlearning used in preparation. We also see it in follow-up to longer form instruction as well. And we also see it for standalone, right? Those pieces of learning that stand all by themselves, something you might see on LinkedIn, maybe on YouTube. Carl and Robin talked about fixing a leaky faucet, right? That sounds like standalone e-learning or video or something to me, right? The last one is support. The idea that we could be providing content for the learner while on the job, right? Now, these have common names, which you probably are very familiar with, right? So the first one is pre-work. We can use microlearning as pre-work preparation for longer form instruction. We can also use it afterwards, and that is usually called boost learning, right? Anytime you're following up after instruction. Standalone, I don't have a good name for it, so I like to call it short form learning, but something that's smaller than kind of what we would normally think of, right? And then performance support. We've seen that coming up even in the previous session as well. And, just like Carl mentioned, there was some comments in the chat about, is performance support microlearning? And I say it is. And I love what Carl said about microlearning being a strategy and those performance support options, those job aids and checklists being just one tactic within those strategies. So that was awesome. I love that. So let's kind of keep that in mind. But as we think about microlearning overall as a strategy, let's talk about 3 ways we can think about measuring those programs. So the first one is your completion or test scores, right? Now, I will talk about each of these in detail in just a moment. So I will tell you, I'm not a big fan of testing in microlearning, but there are times when it's needed, right? So completion or scores. And then we can also look at data and usage patterns. And the last one, of course, is our impact to performance. Now, let's take a look at each one just a little bit in depth. The first one, those completion or test scores. Like I said, I generally, for me, it's like nails on a chalkboard to hear somebody talking about putting a quiz or a test in their microlearning. Because I'm like, No, you kept it short on purpose, and their short-term memory is going to mean that they're going to remember it all in 5 minutes, right? Like they're going to pass the test. Don't worry, right? But at the same time, there are cases where the organization definitely needs a score, or maybe there's like if there are bona fide reasons, and I'll actually show that in just a moment. So, but to me, completion is can be a really big deal, right? Did you finish consuming that piece of micro learning? And as the folks are putting in the chat, yeah, like Christopher said, the tech is really giving us opportunities here. Google Analytics is being mentioned. You know, we've got lots of excitement around XAPI, right? All those things, just knowing, was it taken? Was it completed, right? And I'm sorry, I meant to advance my slide. So this is, you know, your number or percent of people who completed a resource. It could be your number of badges earned if you're doing badging based on multiple pieces being consumed, right? And of course, I mentioned test scores. Simon, it's a good point, right? The completion just tells you about kind of the cost, but not the benefit. But I'm going to add, my next one is usage patterns. And I think we get a lot of that via some of that completion data when we look at it over time. So if we look at things like our usage over time or the repeated views per user, those things do tell us what people found helpful. Because personally, I believe that people vote with their clicks. And so if there was a piece of performance support or a piece of microlearning that was so useful that people kept going back to it, then we know it had value. And I'm going to share a story that really guides my thinking in this regard. It was I'm getting a note that my connection may be interrupted. Did I just freeze? Am I back? Are you guys okay? I'm here. I'm all good. Okay, excellent. Man, like tech day. Okay, so thank you for the comment in the chat there. Awesome. Okay, so my story for you is this. I actually worked at a place where we had a job aid that we created, and what we did was we rolled it out to people, right? And it truly was a piece of performance support. We weren't calling it performance support. We weren't calling it micro learning back then, but that's what it was. And when we looked at the usage data, we had approximately, we actually had two groups. We had one group of users who used it anywhere from 100 times or less. We also had a significant group who used it 1,000 times or more. So I can tell you that either that organization had a lot of problems, or more likely, those people found it helpful because they would not have gone back to that piece of performance support 1,000 times, right? And to me, that story tells itself. I could go to pretty much any stakeholder and say, but they're using it. We know it has to be helpful. Now, I can tell you that it actually happens to be that it was also used in a sales situation. So we had performance data, and the top sellers were those who were using it 1,000 times or more. So we actually also had that tie to performance. But I can tell you that even without it, I could make an incredibly strong case, right? That piece of micro learning was helpful. And so these first two to me actually become really useful, right? Those usage rates over time, your number of repeated views per user, how that looks. Now, you can also get at additional data like the amount of time spent in a resource, or the parts of a resource that have been accessed multiple times or more frequently, things like that. And then the other one, of course, is that holy grail, right? That impact to performance or to the business. Now, what's interesting to me about this one, and I take some cues from Bob Mosier and Con Godfredson, who are really big on the performance support side of microlearning and the just-in-time learning. And they talk about how because microlearning and, again, the performance support or just-in-time training you're creating is so tied to a single objective and a single behavior that you can create a stronger tie to, if we see this happening in the workplace, it's likely because of this thing that we did, because our intervention is small, it's targeted, and it's very close to the moment of performance. So again, if we think about it, performance, and there's kind of two pieces here, right? So you're looking for, can they work faster or have less errors or whatever, right? Or there's the then tie to the business outcomes that come from that, right? Reduction in customer complaints, increased sales, etc. Now, again, as learning people, we can lay claim to this part, and then we are then kind of saying that we did this, but often there are other confounding factors. So it can be a little bit. That's why I like to separate those. So now, to me, the interesting thing is that's your high level, right? And those are your 3 ways you could be thinking about your assessment. However, I also think, remember that circular model we looked at the beginning, I believe that how you use microlearning influences how you evaluate it. And to me, this is the part I get really excited about. And it is this. So bring back the model, right? And to me, this is where why it gets tricky to think about assessing. But if we break it down, I think it makes it easier. So if you're doing pre-work, yes, completion and test scores, that's going to be a big part of it, right? If you're, I did a lot of work with pharma. That pre-work is tested to ensure that you have done your pre-work and you are knowledgeable before you come. Done, right? We can be looking at that completion rate. If it's boost learning, those are often text messages or emails that we're sending. And so those things, then we're looking at click rates and open rates and consumption. If you're doing standalone microlearning, I see it in 2 different flavors. One is the informal learning. That is the stuff that's not required. That's the stuff that you are consuming on LinkedIn or when you do a Google search, or honestly, even now, right? There is nobody who's going to be, ensuring that you are here the whole time, I'm sure, right? So this is your informal learning, right? Well, it is actually kind of formal, but my point is that with informal learning, there's not somebody who's really tracking your completion, right? And so what we would do is we would look for that. We would look at the completion rates. We would look at usage patterns. Because, for example, if I had a piece of microlearning and people took it 1,000 times, I would know I did something good, right? And then on the formal learning side, this is the stuff you usually put on the LMS. Often we're looking then at completion, and often, if we can, getting to impact, right? And then our performance support piece also gets to usage and impact as well. So again, for me, it's partly about trying to break that down a little bit and seeing how we can think about the assessment in these different ways. And of course, you can assess at the individual micro asset level, but you can evaluate the whole program too, right? And so in here, again, I just kind of bring those back, right? We could think about those test scores or completion rates. We could look at those usage patterns, which are actually based on some of that completion and usage data that we were talking about above, right? And then, of course, where we can, making those ties to performance where we can. Now, to me, just sort of wrapping things up, I'm kind of trying to follow the chat. Christopher, I'm going to ask you to ask me some of the questions that are coming in because it's moving fast and there's some good things coming in there. So, but yeah, do you got?
I am here to be back early. We can do Q&A, answer questions. We could talk about this topic for the rest of the afternoon if we really want to. It's totally up to you. So if that's where you're at, let's do it.
Let's do it.
Okay. Well, then let's get rid of this. Let's get rid of this key questions to ask slide and let's just talk the 2 of us. Let's talk the 2 of us. Let's make it about, first of all, one, I think I need to see more emojis as like, come on, keep the emojis up. This has been fantastic with Carla. on this topic. And let's use this time to do a little bit of Q&A, because listening to what you've been talking about, there are a number of things that kind of have hit me in terms of insights and just things I think we can talk to. But I think one of the things that I'm curious as you work with folks, because I see this all the time where sometimes completion data gets a bad rap because people go, oh well, completion doesn't tell us anything. And I would say, I typed it in the chat. This it's a chapter in a book. It tells part of the story, but it's incomplete. So I'm curious, as you think about this, when you work with folks, how do you help them through that, kind of getting past we can get completion data, but we can do more than that because there are a lot of other things. So how are you helping people make that shift? Because it is a shift. It is a complete shift.
Yeah. And I think, when I think of microlearning, I often think of things that are more to the informal learning side, in which case then I'm looking for those patterns over time, not just like I completed it once, but did people come back over time? And did they use it more than once? Or if it was optional for them to use it, how many people really did? So to me, I think that's kind of how you get past just the single completion to starting to look at patterns and trends.
Okay, starting to look at the pattern of behavior and this gets back to the comment we that has come up several times before, is the fact that technology is giving us a lot more visibility into this than we've had before. I mean, I remember in the early days where you might get like web hits that didn't really tell you much of anything, where now we can see how much time did they spend in this section? How many times did they go back? Where were they? A little creepy, but where were they in what system when they actually pulled this up, which can actually help inform, how are we using this? What are they doing? So I'm curious, as you look at that, how has that impacted the design as they think about the whole learning experience?
That's a really good question. So I think one of the things that we've tried to do a lot is working on learner personas to help kind of segment our audiences. Okay. And so, then I think, so I haven't actually done this in practice yet, but I would think that we could then get that data and look at that data per segment, right? And we could then use that data to say, which audience were we impacting the best or the most? Because again, micro gets us at a very granular level to who needs what.
It does.
What do you think? That's a tough question.
What's interesting about it, and this is something I'm working through with my teams a lot right now, because again, going back to Carl's point earlier, microlearning's not a thing. It's a way of approaching things. It's a way of thinking about stuff. And somebody was talking about the fact that it is definitely can be frustrating if you look at the fact that like an LMS may not give you the data that you want out of it. But one of the points you brought up earlier that I think is really important to think about, which is it's a bit of a shift for us as learning folks, is because it's informal, because we're using it differently, we also may put it in different places and use it in different ways. It may not be part of a formal learning pathway in the LMS. We may say, you know what, we're putting this on SharePoint or we're putting this in Google Docs, and that's okay because we're not trying to track this from that standpoint. And that actually makes a big difference in terms of how we even think about the design, where we put it, all these different components.
Yeah. Well, and to your point, Christopher, I always love some of the stuff that Bob Mosier and Con Gottfredson have talked about, which is, that notion of getting as close to that moment of performance as possible. Yeah. Right? And when we do that, the learner often isn't in the LMS, right? I actually haven't been in my LMS today. I've been doing
what
work.
Heresy. How dare you, Carla?
Yes, do not tell, right? Is this recorded?
No, but it's a good point. Right? And again, this goes back to the theme we've been talking about from the very beginning, which is what are we really trying to accomplish? Right. And then based on that, let's craft the experience and the content and all of these things around that. And so the other thing too, because I've got a point of view on this, but I'm curious how you approach this, because one of the risks that I've seen with measurement, is it's because we have access to so much data, so much stuff now, there can be this tendency to say, let's just capture it all. Like, let's measure everything because that's going to be important. And in some places I've seen that cause more problems than others. So I'm curious your take on how do you help people balance that? Because the reality is, somebody said it earlier, and I agree, we can literally see everything now. I mean, we can see what you clicked on, how long you read this word, like everything you did, to the point where it goes, well, but is tracking that and measuring adding value to the outcome that we're trying to measure or not?
Well, and I think to your point, it does become about that outcome, right? Like, what is the thing you want to know? Right. And I know some people say, okay, if you take a lot of data, you can look for trends and patterns and insights. But at the same time, I kind of need to know kind of where I'm looking, right?
Yes.
And so I think to your point, it's about recognizing what you're trying to figure out or find out, and then looking at the data that's related to those things. Does that?
Okay.
What's
No,
your
well,
opinion
no,
on this?
you know, it really depends, because I've got mixed feelings on it, honestly, and it depends on the day and the topic and what we're doing. Like much in my life, right? Like much in my life, but I really think about the fact that, and I like Zolt's point. You almost have to start with a hypothesis and then work. Okay, what data is going to help inform our hypothesis? And the reason I bring this up as an important factor for people in the field to think about is, as we move into this technological age, capturing all this data does open us to risk sometimes. It can open us to risk having too much data that now, how are we storing it? How are we managing it? What are we doing with it? And you can get yourself in some trouble if you're not careful with it. So that's where I tend to advise people to be saying, be careful that you're not just saying, let's just get absolutely everything we can. Where are they in Teams? And what did they say in their chat messages and all? Yeah, or not, because I wouldn't want necessarily somebody doing all of that to me. So let's not do that to our learners. But I think this point of, well, but if we start looking at, what are I think the points you brought up about interactions, are they coming back? We can sanitize that and start seeing, hey, how much repeat behavior are we seeing? And then we test our hypothesis and see, well, what does that inform about us?
Or even if it's something that they kind of realistically would use once, did they share it with a friend? Like, did they say, hey, this is good enough, I want to recommend it to others, right? I think that sort of data, and again, it kind of comes to where marketers have been for a long time, right? Which is,
yes,
do you use it and do you come back and do you share it with others? But I think,
and those are important pieces. They're important pieces. And, I think one of the things that's interesting is, so Zolt brought this up. He goes, the point of learning analytics, you know what, Zolt, I'm gonna embarrass you a little bit. I don't know if you'll be embarrassed or not, but I'm gonna pull it up on stage because I can do that. I'm the host. I can do whatever I want. So watch out. But is the fact that, it's not about, measurement is not just about proving our value. Like we have to prove our worth to the organization. It's really about telling impactful stories and showing, and actually in many regards, I think learning analytics is just as much about helping us, as he said, make informed decisions, but also for us to learn, because a lot of times we don't always know, hey, I may not have all the details, or we're going to try this. I'm trying to continue to push my teams more and more. Let's experiment with whether or not this worked. Let's see if it worked. Let's learn from it, because chances are we got some stuff wrong, and let's not wait until we get everything perfect before we do anything. Let's actually kind of learn from it. Go ahead.
Well, I love what you're saying, Christopher, like that idea of rapid iteration, right? And testing as we go. And again, it's something that I know marketing folks do early and often. And we could probably take some lessons from that. Like take a little piece, roll it out to maybe a small group, see if it was helpful, right?
Yeah.
Yeah.
So I am curious though, this piece, because how do you recommend people get started on some of these things? Because this can feel overwhelming. And I think sometimes there can be a little bit of fear of getting into this space. And I made a bit of a joke about it early, but it is true. Sometimes we can be scared to measure because, well, what if we find out it didn't work? Right? Like, what if we find out we had this great idea, we sold everybody on this vision, and then we measured it and, actually turns out it didn't really have the impact that we did. Now, I think there's some culture components, but how do you recommend people kind of get started with this? Because if you haven't measured, and people were honest, I love the vulnerability and transparency where it's like, we're creating a lot of this. I don't really know what happens with it. How do people make those steps?
Well, I think to your point, like kind of a starting small, right? That's your classic consultant's answer, right? Right. Just start small, measure little bits, see what's going on. And what I find really interesting, especially as we think micro, we always, I was in a session just last week where the people were talking about how we need to, help. It was helping people get up to date on the latest advances in this particular software they were using.
Okay.
Right. And so, right, we need people are falling behind. They took the training a year ago and now they don't know all the new features. Fine. And all the designers were like, oh, we need just in time and performance support and micro pieces. Right. And I would agree. And then somebody piped up and said, and actually I knew this data, so I helped with this. You have all of those already existing and nobody's using them. And so we need to think differently because something's not working. And of course, up came we've got information overload. Everyone's posting these things into the Slack channel and it's not.
It's a lot of it. Well, and everybody's getting bombarded by a wealth of things right now. And we can become, if we're not careful, we run the risk of becoming noise to our end users. Is that, hey, this is just more junk, more digital noise that's being thrown at us from someone else. And we go, well, that's not what we're really trying to do. That's not what we're trying to do. So I think we do need to be careful as we think about this. Okay.
And where I was going with that is just even having that bit of data informed our decisions as we moved forward, right?
Yeah.
So
well, and on the measurement one, Zolt, I'm gonna keep teasing you because I know I can. But worst case, you can look for a new job if it didn't work. But the point with it is, I can just say from my position in as a chief learning officer with this, I think sometimes we're afraid to say, hey, it didn't work, or we failed on this. And well, yes, if you approach it that way and go, well, I've been building up all of this momentum. I wrote a bunch of checks that I can't cash now. That's going to come back to bite you. But if you've been setting realistic expectations along the way and saying, we think this, we're going to try this, this is the approach, you can articulate that story. I can tell you right now, I can't think of a time where somebody's come to me with that and it hasn't worked. And I've thrown them out of the room and said, get out of here. I can't talk to the board like that. No, because we're reasonable. And I think there's opportunity to say, well, so what are we going to do about it? And I think that's the part that we have to be prepared for is how do we pivot when we realize, and I think that's one of the things that's exciting about measurement is it gives us the insight to say, we need to pivot.
Yeah. And what is my next step and how do I address it now? Absolutely.
Right.
So I love the comment in the chat there. Agility and change are not failure. I think it's fantastic.
But I think sometimes we've trained ourselves to think that if we make a mistake, somehow we're just, we're falling short and no. So the other thing though, I'm curious your take on this because I've been in L&D from the very beginning, right after being a math teacher. I got into corporate L&D long time ago. And I will say it's easy to get personally attached to your stuff. Okay. Maybe it's just me. I'll just say I'm the only person who's ever done this, but there's a tendency to perhaps get a little bit personally attached to the things you've done and the things you've created. So I'm curious how, when you work with stuff and this measurement piece, how do you approach that with folks, or how do you encourage people with that to not get personally attached to what you're doing that you failed to see, what this isn't working? Because there is this window where you go, hey, you can catch it before it goes too far. You can learn and pivot before it gets too far, but you won't if you go, I made the most glorious learning course or asset and it's going to work because I made it.
It's beautiful.
Of course, like how could it not? And so I'm curious, how do you help folks work through that?
Oh, what a good question. I think to me, I think about some stuff that Michael Allen writes, and I had the pleasure of working for him for a number of years. And he's a very agile and iterative guy. And so he says, if anybody's familiar with Michael Allen and his work, he says that he does rapid prototyping, and he says anytime a prototype is so fleshed out that someone would be not willing to throw it away because it didn't work, you invested too much time.
Okay.
And so I lived that for like almost 5 years, right? And so I think there's a little bit of me that's kind of like, if we're not willing to throw it away because it doesn't work, we have made a mistake, right? We've gotten too far down a path or a direction. Now, to your point, for me, that's in that rapid prototyping early phase.
Yeah.
Before hopefully you like put 3 months and lots of money and time behind it. But I think even then, along the way, you have to be able to say, you know what, it didn't work. It's not what I wanted. I've got to pivot. I want to make a change, and we just have to embrace that.
So I've got a question from, I think I'm pronouncing it right, Donnie. I'm going to hand you the mic. Let's see what happens here if you come on board, because hey, you're going to get called into it. So we'll see what happens. And if it doesn't work, well, then nope. It was one of those panic raise hands. Like, I didn't think you were going to call on me. Well, let's give some emojis for at least raising hand and accepting the mic, even though we didn't bring it on. There we go. I like that. But I think, one of the things that you talked about there that is really important as a takeaway is this rapid prototyping. Mic drop. Yes, boss. Excellent work on that one. But I think that point of creating an environment, and honestly, when I first met the 7 Taps team, that was one of the things I liked about their tool, was the fact it created an opportunity to be able to rapidly prototype and say, let's see what this works before we spend all the time and energy creating something with massive time and budgets and all these things. Like, let's rapidly prototype, put something out there, and then let's see if it works. And if it doesn't, it's okay. It's okay. Yeah. We can step away from it.
And I think you're right. And I remember Elena showing me the 7 Taps tool too. And she was like, yeah, so you could build a course in literally 5 to 15 minutes just to try it, just to test it, to test your concept. I was like, that's pretty pleasing.